We're lifting the dahlias and putting them to bed today on Pots and Trowels, and that's brought to you with the support of Cobra Garden and Darlac. Hello and welcome to Pots and Trowels. Well, we're in some friends' garden today, Paula and Stephen, who grow lots of cut flowers, including beautiful dahlias that have done so well this season. They've flowered and flowered and flowered, but it's now the end of the season. Here we are, middle of November, the weather's turned cooler, lots of moisture, lots of rain, so the flowers go over very quickly, or like here, they just simply don't open, they rot in the bud. So it really is, unfortunately, time to say goodbye to dahlias for the season. Now, when it gets to this time of the year, there are two schools of thought. One is leave them in the ground, let them overwinter, and they'll grow back next year. And that's great if you live in a mild part of the country where you don't get frosts that penetrate down into the soil. I prefer to lift them, to be fair, mainly because to give them frost protection, but also if we don't get the frost and we get a wet winter, then I find that the tubers can start to rot in the ground because they don't like those excessive wet conditions. But also I find that in the spring, if you've left them in the ground, when the little shoots start to develop underground, ready to grow and push through into the open, the slugs that live in the soil nibble them off, and you can finish up getting loads and loads of slug damage on your plants. And the main reason though is I find that younger plants produce the best flowers, and if you're certainly growing them for cut flower like Paula and Stephen, they will lift these tubers, they will overwinter them, and then in early spring they will take cuttings off those tubers, and those young plants will have the longest stems for cut flower. If you don't want them for cut flower, just for pretty plants and flowers in the garden, then you can plant your existing tubers back in the ground. So how do you lift them? Very simple. Very often we wait until we've had some frosts and that will blacken them, and that is a sign to lift them. But as I said, it's been very mild this autumn, and these need clearing out the ground before it gets too wet. So it's just simply a case of going round with a pair of secateurs and cutting down all the old growth like that. And that can all be shredded and added to the compost heap where it will rot down. So there we can see now we've got the thick stems that have grown off the tuber that was planted in the spring. So what we need to do is lift that very carefully out the ground. Now the soil here is very heavy clay, so what they do is put a thick mulch over there to improve the soil. And if I just rake that, we can actually just see the tubers there fairly close to the surface. So should this be a cold winter, the frost would certainly get those because they're only an inch or two deep. So I'm going to get the fork, take it a little away from the base and push it in. If we do a little bit of damage, it's not too much, but we want to try and minimize the damage. And I'm just going to lever that tuber out of the ground. Okay, there it comes. So that's a nice, good, healthy tuber. I'm just going to knock a little bit of the soil off it just so I can inspect it more than anything. So we'll just give that a shake. And what I like to do is to trim off one or two of these finer roots on this. These are what we want, these thick, fleshy tubers here. This is where all the food's stored to survive the winter, and it's what will start the plant into growth next year. But these very fine wispy roots will dry and rot off. So you can, if you want, just trim a few of those off now. Just tidy it up a little bit so we can actually see the tuber. If there's any of the big tubers get damaged, and I've managed to lift this without damaging them, again we can take those off because we don't want those ragged edges which will let the rot get into them. So it's just a bit of a tidy up like this, taking some of those off, and that is basically it. You can spend a little more time taking a few more off if you want to, but that's our tuber. And the way I like to store them is either in a bucket or a crate, or this is an old plant pot here. And what I'm going to do, hopefully this is a 10 litre plant pot about the size of a 2-gallon bucket. Hopefully that will just sit into there. A bit broken off, but it's not a problem, like that. What I would do then is put a label in it with the name on it so that you remember what it is. Now you could store that as it is like that, but I always think they store slightly better if they've got a bit of moisture. The old way used to be to dry them all off completely, so they were bone dry and they would wizen a little bit, but then they take a bit longer to wake up in the spring. So I find that by putting them in pots like this and then just getting a little bit of the soil, or if you've got some old compost from summer containers, and just sprinkle a little bit of that damp soil and just shake it, so you're not completely potting them, but what it does, it just stops them dehydrating, and I find they overwinter much better that way. So what we would do with that now is we need to store that somewhere frost-free, cool but soft, frost-free. If it's too warm, again, they will dry out very quickly. So a shed or a garage, or if you've got a frost-free greenhouse, I just stand them under the bench like that, and they will be absolutely fine. Now, if you want to take cuttings off these in the spring to produce new tubers, then what you would do is just give them a little bit of heat about February time, a little bit of moisture just to waken them up, and you'll find from very low down here at the base of these stems, you'll get new shoots, and you can sever those very carefully with a knife and root them in some small pots, and they will produce plants. If you're going to plant this existing tuber back into the garden, then I would leave it in its cool position, and as soon as we see the shoots appear in spring, usually sort of mid-April to early May, you can plant this back directly into the soil so that the tubers are a few inches deep. Just check it to make sure it's protected in frosty weather as you get the new growth, and that will then grow and flower, and you'll get an abundance of beautiful blooms all through next summer. But I am still a great believer, now is the time to lift them, to protect them through the winter. Well, thank you for watching. I'm going to now take these last few dahlias of the season so we can enjoy them in the house. We'll be back again next week doing some practical jobs in the garden, so we'll see you then. Bye.